My family is American and has been for generations, in all its branches, direct and collateral. Matthew Grant, the founder of the branch in America, of which I am a descendant, reached Dorchester, Massachusetts, in May 1630. In 1635 he moved to what is now Windsor, Connecticut, and was the surveyor for that colony for more than 40 years. He was also, for many years of the time, town clerk. He was a married man when he arrived at Dorchester, but his children were all born in this country. His eldest son, Samuel, took lands on the east side of the Connecticut River opposite Windsor, which have been held and occupied by descendants of his to this day. I am of the 8th generation from Matthew Grant and 7th from Samuel. Matthew Grant's first wife died a few years after their settlement in Windsor, and he soon after married the widow Rockwell, who, with her first husband, had been fellow passengers with him and his first wife on the ship Mary and John from Dorchester, England, in 1630. Mrs. Rockwell had several children by her first marriage and others by her second. By intermarriage, 2 or 3 generations later, I am descended from both the wives of Matthew Grant. In the 5th descending generation, my great-grandfather, Noah Grant, and his younger brother, Solomon, held commissions in the English army in 1756 in the war against the French and Indians. Both were killed that year. My grandfather, also named Noah, was then but 9 years old. At the breaking out of the War of the Revolution, after the battles of Concord and Lexington, he went with a Connecticut company to join the Continental Army and was present at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He served until the fall of Yorktown, or through the entire Revolutionary War. He must, however, have been on furlough part of the time, as I believe most of the soldiers of that period were, for he married in Connecticut during the war, had 2 children, and was a widower at the close. Soon after this, he emigrated to Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, and settled near the town of Greensburg in that county. He took with him the younger of his 2 children, Peter Grant. The elder, Solomon, remained with his relatives in Connecticut until old enough to do for himself when he emigrated to the British West Indies. Not long after his settlement in Pennsylvania, my grandfather, Captain Noah Grant, married a Miss Kelly, and in 1799 he emigrated again, this time to Ohio, and settled where the town of Deerfield now stands. He had now 5 children, including Peter, a son by his first marriage. My father, Jesse R. Grant, was the second child, oldest son by the second marriage. Peter Grant went early to Maysville, Kentucky, where he was very prosperous, married, had a family of 9 children, and was drowned at the mouth of the Kanawha River, Virginia, in 1825, being at the time one of the wealthy men of the West. My grandmother Grant died in 1805, leaving 7 children. This broke up the family. Captain Noah Grant was not thrifty in the way of laying up stores on earth, and after the death of his second wife, he went, with the 2 youngest children, to live with his son Peter in Maysville. The rest of the family found homes in the neighborhood of Deerfield, my father in the family of Judge Todd, the father of the late Governor Todd of Ohio. His industry and independence of character were such that I imagine his labour compensated fully for the expense of his maintenance. There must have been a cordiality in his welcome into the Todd family, for to the day of his death he looked upon Judge Todd and his wife with all the reverence he could have felt if they had been parents instead of benefactors. I have often heard him speak of Mrs. Todd as the most admirable woman he had ever known. He remained with the Todd family only a few years, until old enough to learn a trade. He went first, I believe, with his half-brother, Peter Grant, who, though not a tanner himself, owned a tannery in Maysville, Kentucky. Here he learned his trade, and in a few years returned to Deerfield and worked for, and lived in the family of a Mr. Brown, the father of John Brown, whose body lies mouldering in the grave, while his soul goes marching on. I have often heard my father speak of John Brown, particularly since the events at Harper's Ferry. Brown was a boy when they lived in the same house, but he knew him afterwards, and regarded him as a man of great purity of character, of high moral and physical courage, but a fanatic and extremist in whatever he advocated. It was certainly the act of an insane man to attempt the invasion of the South and the overthrow of slavery, with less than 20 men. My father set up for himself in business, establishing a tannery at Ravenna, the county seat of Portage County. In a few years he removed from Ravenna and set up the same business at Point Pleasant, Clermont County, Ohio. During the minority of my father, the West afforded but poor facilities for the most opulent of the youth to acquire an education, and the majority were dependent, almost exclusively, upon their own exertions for whatever learning they obtained. I have often heard him say that his time at school was limited to 6 months, when he was very young, too young, indeed, to learn much, or to appreciate the advantages of an education, and to a quarter's schooling afterwards, probably while living with Judge Todd. But his thirst for education was intense. He learned rapidly, and was a constant reader up to the day of his death in his 80th year. Books were scarce in the Western Reserve during his youth, but he read every book he could borrow in the neighborhood where he lived. This scarcity gave him the early habit of studying everything he read, so that when he got through with a book, he knew everything in it. The habit continued through life. Even after reading the daily papers, which he never neglected, he could give all the important information they contained. He made himself an excellent English scholar, and before he was 20 years of age was a constant contributor to Western newspapers, and was also, from that time until he was 50 years old, an able debater in the societies for this purpose, which were common in the West at that time. He always took an active part in politics, but was never a candidate for office, except, I believe, that he was the first mayor of Georgetown. He supported Jackson for the presidency, but he was a Whig, a great admirer of Henry Clay, and never voted for any other Democrat for high office after Jackson. My mother's family lived in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, for several generations. I have little information about her ancestors. Her family took no interest in genealogy, so that my grandfather, who died when I was 16 years old, knew only back to his grandfather. On the other side, my father took a great interest in the subject, and in his researches he found that there was an entailed estate in Windsor, Connecticut, belonging to the family, to which his nephew, Lawson Grant, still living, was the heir. He was so much interested in the subject that he got his nephew to empower him to act in the matter, and in 1832 or 1833, when I was a boy 10 or 11 years old, he went to Windsor, proved the title beyond dispute, and perfected the claim of the owners for a consideration, $3,000, I think. I remember the circumstance well, and remember, too, hearing him say on his return that he found some widows living on the property who had little or nothing beyond their homes. From these he refused to receive any recompense. My mother's father, John Simpson, moved from Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, to Clermont County, Ohio, about the year 1819, taking with him his 4 children, 3 daughters, and 1 son. My mother, Hannah Simpson, was the third of these children, and was then over 20 years of age. Her oldest sister was at that time married, and had several children. She still lives in Clermont County at this writing, October 5, 1884, and is over 90 years of age. Until her memory failed her a few years ago, she thought the country ruined beyond recovery when the Democratic Party lost control in 1860. Her family, which was large, inherited her views, with the exception of 1 son who settled in Kentucky before the war. He was the only one of the children who entered the volunteer service to suppress the rebellion. Her brother, next of age and now past 88, is also still living in Clermont County, within a few miles of the old homestead, and is as active in mind as ever. He was a supporter of the government during the war, and remains a firm believer that national success by the Democratic Party means irretrievable ruin. In June 1821, my father, Jesse R. Grant, married Hannah Simpson. I was born on the 27th of April, 1822, at Point Pleasant, Clermont County, Ohio. In the fall of 1823, we moved to Georgetown, the county seat of Brown, the adjoining county east. This place remained my home until at the age of 17, in 1839, I went to West Point. The schools, at the time of which I write, were very indifferent. There were no free schools, and none in which the scholars were classified. They were all supported by subscription, and a single teacher, who was often a man or a woman incapable of teaching much, even if they imparted all they knew, would have 30 or 40 scholars, male and female, from the infant learning the ABCs up to the young lady of 18 and the boy of 20, studying the highest branches taught, the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. I never saw an algebra or other mathematical work higher than the arithmetic in Georgetown until after I was appointed to West Point. I then bought a work on algebra in Cincinnati, but having no teacher, it was Greek to me. My life in Georgetown was uneventful. From the age of 5 or 6 until 17, I attended the subscription schools of the village, except during the winters of 1836 to 7 and 1838 to 9. The former period was spent in Maysville, Kentucky, attending the school of Richardson and Rand, the latter in Ripley, Ohio, at a private school. I was not studious in habit, and probably did not make progress enough to compensate for the outlay for board and tuition. At all events, both winters were spent in going over the same old arithmetic which I knew every word of before, and repeating, "A noun is the name of a thing," which I had also heard my Georgetown teachers repeat until I had come to believe it, but I cast no reflections upon my old teacher, Richardson. He turned out bright scholars from his school, many of whom have filled conspicuous places in the service of their states. 2 of my contemporaries there, who I believe never attended any other institution of learning, have held seats in Congress, and one, if not both, other high offices. These are Wadsworth and Brewster. My father was, from my earliest recollection, in comfortable circumstances, considering the times, his place of residence, and the community in which he lived. Mindful of his own lack of facilities for acquiring an education, his greatest desire in maturer years was for the education of his children. Consequently, as stated before, I never missed a quarter from school from the time I was old enough to attend till the time of leaving home. This did not exempt me from labour. In my early days, everyone laboured more or less in the region where my youth was spent, and more in proportion to their private means. It was only the very poor who were exempt. While my father carried on the manufacture of leather and worked at the trade himself, he owned and tilled considerable land. I detested the trade, preferring almost any other labour, but I was fond of agriculture and of all employment in which horses were used. We had, among other lands, 50 acres of forest within a mile of the village. In the fall of the year, choppers were employed to cut enough wood to last a 12-month. When I was 7 or 8 years of age, I began hauling all the wood used in the house and shops. I could not load it on the wagons, of course, at that time, but I could drive, and the choppers would load, and someone at the house unload. When about 11 years old, I was strong enough to hold a plough. From that age until 17, I did all the work done with horses, such as breaking up the land, furrowing, ploughing corn and potatoes, bringing in the crops when harvested, hauling all the wood, besides tending 2 or 3 horses, a cow or 2, and sawing wood for stoves, etc., while still attending school. For this I was compensated by the fact that there was never any scolding or punishing by my parents, no objection to rational enjoyments, such as fishing, going to the creek a mile away to swim in summer, taking a horse and visiting my grandparents in the adjoining county, 15 miles off, skating on the ice in winter, or taking a horse and sleigh when there was snow on the ground. While still quite young, I had visited Cincinnati, 45 miles away, several times, alone, also Maysville, Kentucky, often, and once Louisville. The journey to Louisville was a big one for a boy of that day. I had also gone once with a 2-horse carriage to Chillicothe, about 70 miles, with a neighbour's family, who were removing to Toledo, Ohio, and returned alone, and had gone once, in like manner, to Flat Rock, Kentucky, about 70 miles away. On this latter occasion I was 15 years of age. While at Flat Rock, at the house of a Mr. Payne, whom I was visiting with his brother, a neighbour of ours in Georgetown, I saw a very fine saddle horse, which I rather coveted, and proposed to Mr. Payne, the owner, to trade him for one of the two I was driving. Payne hesitated to trade with a boy, but asking his brother about it, the latter told him that it would be all right, that I was allowed to do as I pleased with the horses. I was 70 miles from home with a carriage to take back, and Mr. Payne said he did not know that his horse had ever had a collar on. I asked to have him hitched to a farm wagon, and we would soon see whether he would work. It was soon evident that the horse had never worn harness before, but he showed no viciousness, and I expressed a confidence that I could manage him. A trade was at once struck, I receiving $10 difference. The next day, Mr. Payne, of Georgetown, and I started on our return. We got along very well for a few miles, when we encountered a ferocious dog that frightened the horses and made them run. The new animal kicked at every jump he made. I got the horses stopped, however, before any damage was done, and without running into anything. After giving them a little rest, to quiet their fears, we started again. That instant the new horse kicked and started to run once more. The road we were on struck the turnpike within half a mile of the point where the second runaway commenced, and there was an embankment 20 or more feet deep on the opposite side of the pike. I got the horses stopped on the very brink of the precipice. My new horse was terribly frightened and trembled like an aspen, but he was not half so badly frightened as my companion, Mr. Payne, who deserted me after this last experience and took passage on a freight wagon for Maysville. Every time I attempted to start, my new horse would commence to kick. I was in quite a dilemma for a time. Once in Maysville, I could borrow a horse from an uncle who lived there, but I was more than a day's travel from that point. Finally, I took out my bandana, the style of handkerchief in universal use then, and with this blindfolded my horse. In this way I reached Maysville safely the next day, no doubt much to the surprise of my friend. Here I borrowed a horse from my uncle, and the following day we proceeded on our journey. About half my school days in Georgetown were spent at the school of John D. White, a North Carolinian, and the father of Chilton White, who represented the district in Congress for one term during the rebellion. Mr. White was always a Democrat in politics, and Chilton followed his father. He had two older brothers, all three being schoolmates of mine at their father's school, who did not go the same way. The second brother died before the rebellion began. He was a Whig, and afterwards a Republican. His oldest brother was a Republican and brave soldier during the rebellion. Chilton is reported as having told of an earlier horse trade of mine. As he told the story, there was a Mr. Ralston living within a few miles of the village, who owned a colt which I very much wanted. My father had offered $20 for it, but Ralston wanted $25. I was so anxious to have the colt that after the owner left, I begged to be allowed to take him at the price demanded. My father yielded, but said $20 was all the horse was worth, and told me to offer that price. If it was not accepted, I was to offer 22.5, and if that would not get him, to give the 25. I at once mounted a horse and went for the colt. When I got to Mr. Ralston's house, I said to him, "Papa says I may offer you $20 for the colt, but if you won't take that, I am to offer 22.5, and if you won't take that, to give you 25. It would not require a Connecticut man to guess the price finally agreed upon. This story is nearly true. I certainly showed very plainly that I had come for the colt and meant to have him. I could not have been over 8 years old at the time. This transaction caused me great heartburning. The story got out among the boys of the village, and it was a long time before I heard the last of it. Boys enjoy the misery of their companions, at least village boys in that day did, and in later life I have found that all adults are not free from the peculiarity. I kept the horse until he was 4 years old, when he went blind, and I sold him for $20. When I went to Maysville to school in 1836, at the age of 14, I recognized my colt as one of the blind horses working on the treadwheel of the ferryboat. I have described enough of my early life to give an impression of the whole. I did not like to work, but I did as much of it while young as grown men can be hired to do in these days, and attended school at the same time. I had as many privileges as any boy in the village, and probably more than most of them. I have no recollection of ever having been punished at home, either by scolding or by the rod. But at school the case was different. The rod was freely used there, and I was not exempt from its influence. I can see John D. White, the school teacher, now, with his long beech switch always in his hand. It was not always the same one either. Switches were brought in bundles from a beechwood near the schoolhouse by the boys for whose benefit they were intended. Often a whole bundle would be used up in a single day. I never had any hard feelings against my teacher, either while attending the school or in later years when reflecting upon my experience. Mr. White was a kind-hearted man and was much respected by the community in which he lived. He only followed the universal custom of the period, and that under which he had received his own education. In the winter of 1838-9, I was attending school at Ripley, only 10 miles distant from Georgetown, but spent the Christmas holidays at home. During this vacation, my father received a letter from the Honourable Thomas Morris, then United States Senator from Ohio. When he read it, he said to me, "Ulysses, I believe you are going to receive the appointment." "What appointment?" I inquired. "To West Point. I have applied for it." "But I won't go," I said. He said he thought I would, and I thought so too if he did. I really had no objection to going to West Point, except that I had a very exalted idea of the acquirements necessary to get through. I did not believe I possessed them, and could not bear the idea of failing. There had been 4 boys from our village, or its immediate neighbourhood, who had been graduated from West Point, and never a failure of anyone appointed from Georgetown, except in the case of the one whose place I was to take. He was the son of Dr. Bailey, our nearest and most intimate neighbour. Young Bailey had been appointed in 1837. Finding before the January examination following that he could not pass, he resigned and went to a private school, and remained there until the following year when he was reappointed. Before the next examination he was dismissed. Dr. Bailey was a proud and sensitive man, and felt the failure of his son so keenly that he forbade his return home. There were no telegraphs in those days to disseminate news rapidly, no railroads west of the Alleghenies, and but few east, and above all, there were no reporters prying into other people's private affairs. Consequently, it did not become generally known that there was a vacancy at West Point from our district until I was appointed. I presume Mrs. Bailey confided to my mother the fact that Bartlett had been dismissed, and that the doctor had forbidden his son's return home. The Honourable Thomas L. Hamer, one of the ablest men Ohio ever produced, was our member of Congress at the time, and had the right of nomination. He and my father had been members of the same debating society, where they were generally pitted on opposite sides, and intimate personal friends from their early manhood up to a few years before. In politics they differed. Hamer was a lifelong Democrat, while my father was a Whig. They had a warm discussion, which finally became angry, over some act of President Jackson, the removal of the deposit of public moneys, I think, after which they never spoke until after my appointment. I know both of them felt badly over this estrangement, and would have been glad at any time to come to a reconciliation, but neither would make the advance. Under these circumstances my father would not write to Hamer for the appointment, but he wrote to Thomas Morris, United States Senator from Ohio, informing him that there was a vacancy at West Point from our district, and that he would be glad if I could be appointed to fill it. This letter, I presume, was turned over to Mr. Hamer, and as there was no other applicant, he cheerfully appointed me. This healed the breach between the two, never after reopened. Besides the argument used by my father in favour of my going to West Point, that he thought I would go, there was another very strong inducement. I had always a great desire to travel. I was already the best-travelled boy in Georgetown, except the sons of one man, John Walker, who had emigrated to Texas with his family, and immigrated back as soon as he could get the means to do so. In his short stay in Texas, he acquired a very different opinion of the country from what one would form going there now. I had been east to Wheeling, Virginia, and north to the Western Reserve, in Ohio, west to Louisville, and south to Bourbon County, Kentucky, besides having driven or ridden pretty much over the whole country within 50 miles of home. Going to West Point would give me the opportunity of visiting the two great cities of the continent, Philadelphia and New York. This was enough. When these places were visited, I would have been glad to have had a steamboat or railroad collision, or any other accident happen, by which I might have received a temporary injury sufficient to make me ineligible, for a time, to enter the academy. Nothing of the kind occurred, and I had to face the music. Georgetown has a remarkable record for a Western village. It is, and has been from its earliest existence, a democratic town. There was probably no time during the rebellion when, if the opportunity could have been afforded, it would not have voted for Jefferson Davis for President of the United States over Mr. Lincoln or any other representative of his party, unless it was immediately after some of John Morgan's men, in his celebrated raid through Ohio, spent a few hours in the village. The rebels helped themselves to whatever they could find, horses, boots, and shoes, especially horses, and many ordered meals to be prepared for them by the families. This was no doubt a far pleasanter duty for some families than it would have been to render a like service for Union soldiers. The line between the rebel and Union element in Georgetown was so marked that it led to divisions even in the churches. There were churches in that part of Ohio where treason was preached regularly, and where, to secure membership, hostility to the government, to the war, and to the liberation of the slaves, was far more essential than a belief in the authenticity or credibility of the Bible. There were men in Georgetown who filled all the requirements for membership in these churches. Yet this far-off western village, with a population, including old and young, male and female, of about 1,000, about enough for the organization of a single regiment if all had been men capable of bearing arms, furnished the Union Army 4 general officers and 1 colonel, West Point graduates, and 9 generals and field officers of volunteers that I can think of. Of the graduates from West Point, all had citizenship elsewhere at the breaking out of the rebellion, except possibly General A.V. Kautz, who had remained in the army from his graduation. 2 of the colonels also entered the service from other localities. The other 7, General McGroyty, Colonels White, Fife, Loudon, and Marshall, Majors King and Bailey, were all residents of Georgetown when the war broke out, and all of them, who were alive at the close, returned there. Major Bailey was the cadet who had preceded me at West Point. He was killed in West Virginia, in his first engagement. As far as I know, every boy who has entered West Point from that village since my time has been graduated. I took passage on a steamer at Ripley, Ohio, for Pittsburgh, about the middle of May, 1839. Western boats at that day did not make regular trips at stated times, but would stop anywhere, and for any length of time, for passengers or freight. I have myself been detained 2 or 3 days at a place after steam was up, the gangplanks, all but one, drawn in, and after the time advertised for starting had expired. On this occasion we had no vexatious delays, and in about 3 days Pittsburgh was reached. From Pittsburgh I chose passage by the canal to Harrisburg, rather than by the more expeditious stage. This gave a better opportunity of enjoying the fine scenery of western Pennsylvania, and I had rather a dread of reaching my destination at all. At that time the canal was much patronized by travellers, and with the comfortable packets of the period, no mode of conveyance could be more pleasant when time was not an object. From Harrisburg to Philadelphia there was a railroad, the first I had ever seen, except the one on which I had just crossed the summit of the Alleghany Mountains, and over which canal boats were transported. In travelling by the road from Harrisburg, I thought the perfection of rapid transit had been reached. We travelled at least 18 miles an hour when at full speed, and made the whole distance averaging probably as much as 12 miles an hour. This seemed like annihilating space. I stopped 5 days in Philadelphia, saw about every street in the city, attended the theatre, visited Girard College, which was then in course of construction, and got reprimanded from home afterwards for dallying by the way so long. My sojourn in New York was shorter, but long enough to enable me to see the city very well. I reported at West Point on the 30th or 31st of May, and about 2 weeks later passed my examination for admission, without difficulty, very much to my surprise. A military life had no charms for me, and I had not the faintest idea of staying in the army even if I should be graduated, which I did not expect. The encampment which preceded the commencement of academic studies was very wearisome and uninteresting. When the 28th of August came, the date for breaking up camp and going into barracks, I felt as though I had been at West Point always, and that if I stayed to graduation, I would have to remain always. I did not take hold of my studies with avidity. In fact, I rarely ever read over a lesson the second time during my entire cadetship. I could not sit in my room doing nothing. There is a fine library connected with the academy from which cadets can get books to read in their quarters. I devoted more time to these than to books relating to the course of studies. Much of the time, I am sorry to say, was devoted to novels, but not those of a trashy sort. I read all of Bulwer's then published, Cooper's, Marryat's, Scott's, Washington Irving's works, Lever's, and many others that I do not now remember. Mathematics was very easy to me, so that when January came, I passed the examination, taking a good standing in that branch. In French, the only other study at that time in the first year's course, my standing was very low. In fact, if the class had been turned the other end foremost, I should have been near head. I never succeeded in getting squarely at either end of my class, in any one study, during the 4 years. I came near it in French, artillery, infantry and cavalry tactics, and conduct. Early in the session of the Congress, which met in December 1839, a bill was discussed abolishing the military academy. I saw in this an honourable way to obtain a discharge, and read the debates with much interest, but with impatience at the delay in taking action, for I was selfish enough to favour the bill. It never passed, and a year later, although the time hung drearily with me, I would have been sorry to have seen it succeed. My idea then was to get through the course, secure a detail for a few years as assistant professor of mathematics at the academy, and afterwards obtain a permanent position as professor in some respectable college. But circumstances always did shape my course different from my plans. At the end of 2 years, the class received the usual furlough, extending from the close of the June examination to the 28th of August. This I enjoyed beyond any other period of my life. My father had sold out his business in Georgetown, where my youth had been spent, and to which my daydreams carried me back as my future home, if I should ever be able to retire on a competency. He had moved to Bethel, only 12 miles away, in the adjoining county of Claremont, and had bought a young horse that had never been in harness, for my special use under the saddle during my furlough. Most of my time was spent among my old schoolmates. These 10 weeks were shorter than 1 week at West Point. Persons acquainted with the academy know that the corps of cadets is divided into 4 companies for the purpose of military exercises. These companies are officered from the cadets, the superintendent and commandant selecting the officers for their military bearing and qualifications. The adjutant, quartermaster, 4 captains and 12 lieutenants are taken from the first, or senior class, the sergeants from the second, or junior class, and the corporals from the third, or sophomore class. I had not been called out as a corporal, but when I returned from furlough, I found myself the last but one, about my standing in all the tactics, of 18 sergeants. The promotion was too much for me. That year my standing in the class, as shown by the number of demerits of the year, was about the same as it was among the sergeants, and I was dropped and served the 4th year as a private. During my first year's encampment, General Scott visited West Point and reviewed the cadets. With his commanding figure, his quite colossal size and showy uniform, I thought him the finest specimen of manhood my eyes had ever beheld, and the most to be envied. I could never resemble him in appearance, but I believe I did have a presentiment for a moment that some day I should occupy his place on review, although I had no intention then of remaining in the army. My experience in a horse trade 10 years before, and the ridicule it caused me, were too fresh in my mind for me to communicate this presentiment to even my most intimate chum. The next summer, Martin Van Buren, then President of the United States, visited West Point and reviewed the cadets. He did not impress me with the awe which Scott had inspired. In fact, I regarded General Scott and Captain C.F. Smith, the Commandant of Cadets, as the two men most to be envied in the nation. I retained a high regard for both up to the day of their death. The last 2 years wore away more rapidly than the first 2, but they still seemed about 5 times as long as Ohio years to me. At last all the examinations were passed, and the members of the class were called upon to record their choice of arms of service and regiments. I was anxious to enter the cavalry, or dragoons as they were then called, but there was only one regiment of dragoons in the army at that time, and attached to that, besides the full complement of officers, there were at least 4 brevet second lieutenants. I recorded therefore my first choice, dragoons, 2nd, 4th Infantry, and got the latter. Again there was a furlough, or more properly speaking, leave of absence, for the class were now commissioned officers, this time to the end of September. Again I went to Ohio to spend my vacation among my old schoolmates, and again I found a fine saddle horse purchased for my special use, besides a horse and buggy that I could drive, but I was not in a physical condition to enjoy myself quite as well as on the former occasion. For 6 months before graduation I had had a desperate cough, Tyler's grip it was called, and I was very much reduced, weighing but 117 pounds, just my weight at entrance, though I had grown 6 inches in stature in the meantime. There was consumption in my father's family, 2 of his brothers having died of that disease, which made my symptoms more alarming. The brother and sister next younger than myself died during the rebellion of the same disease, and I seemed the most promising subject for it of the 3 in 1843. Having made alternate choice of 2 different arms of service with different uniforms, I could not get a uniform suit until notified of my assignment. I left my measurement with a tailor, with directions not to make the uniform until I notified him whether it was to be for infantry or dragoons. Notice did not reach me for several weeks, and then it took at least a week to get the letter of instructions to the tailor, and 2 more to make the clothes and have them sent to me. This was a time of great suspense. I was impatient to get on my uniform and see how it looked, and probably wanted my old schoolmates, particularly the girls, to see me in it. The conceit was knocked out of me by 2 little circumstances that happened soon after the arrival of the clothes, which gave me a distaste for military uniform that I never recovered from. Soon after the arrival of the suit, I donned it, and put off for Cincinnati on horseback. While I was riding along a street of that city, imagining that everyone was looking at me, with a feeling akin to mine when I first saw General Scott, a little urchin, bareheaded, footed, with dirty and ragged pants, held up by bare a single gallows, that's what suspenders were called then, and a shirt that had not seen a wash-tub for weeks, turned to me and cried, "Soldier, will you work?" "No, sir." "I'll sell my shirt first." The horse trade and its dire consequences were recalled to mind. The other circumstance occurred at home. Opposite our house in Bethel stood the old stage tavern where man and beast found accommodation. The stableman was rather dissipated, but possessed of some humour. On my return I found him parading the streets and attending in the stable, barefooted, but in a pair of sky-blue nankeen pantaloons, just the colour of my uniform trousers, with a strip of white cotton sheeting sewed down the outside seams in imitation of mine. The joke was a huge one in the mind of many of the people, and was much enjoyed by them, but I did not appreciate it so highly. During the remainder of my leave of absence, my time was spent in visiting friends in Georgetown and Cincinnati, and occasionally other towns in that part of the state. On the 30th of September I reported for duty at Jefferson Barracks, St. Louis, with the 4th United States Infantry. It was the largest military post in the country at that time, being garrisoned by 16 companies of infantry, 8 of the 3D Regiment, the remainder of the 4th. Colonel Stephen Kearney, one of the ablest officers of the day, commanded the post, and under him discipline was kept at a high standard, but without vexatious rules or regulations. Every drill and roll call had to be attended, but in the intervals officers were permitted to enjoy themselves, leaving the garrison and going where they pleased, without making written application to state where they were going for how long, etc., so that they were back for their next duty. It did seem to me, in my early army days, that too many of the older officers, when they came to command posts, made it a study to think what orders they could publish to annoy their subordinates and render them uncomfortable. I noticed, however, a few years later, when the Mexican War broke out, that most of this class of officers discovered they were possessed of disabilities which entirely incapacitated them for active field service. They had the moral courage to proclaim it too. They were right, but they did not always give their disease the right name. At West Point I had a classmate. In the last year of our studies he was roommate also, F.T. Dent, whose family resided some 5 miles west of Jefferson Barracks. 2 of his unmarried brothers were living at home at that time, and as I had taken with me from Ohio my horse, saddle and bridle, I soon found my way out to Whitehaven, the name of the Dent estate. As I found the family congenial, my visits became frequent. There were at home, besides the young men, 2 daughters, one a schoolmiss of 15, the other a girl of 8 or 9. There was still an older daughter of 17, who had been spending several years at boarding school in St. Louis, but who, though through school, had not yet returned home. She was spending the winter in the city with connections, the family of Colonel John O'Fallon, well known in St. Louis. In February she returned to her country home. After that I do not know, but my visits became more frequent. They certainly did become more enjoyable. We would often take walks or go on horseback to visit the neighbours until I became quite well acquainted in that vicinity. Sometimes one of the brothers would accompany us, sometimes one of the younger sisters. If the 4th Infantry had remained at Jefferson Barracks, it is possible, even probable, that this life might have continued for some years without my finding out that there was anything serious the matter with me. But in the following May a circumstance occurred which developed my sentiment so palpably that there was no mistaking it. The annexation of Texas was at this time the subject of violent discussion in Congress, in the press, and by individuals. The administration of President Tyler, then in power, was making the most strenuous efforts to effect the annexation, which was indeed the great and absorbing question of the day. During these discussions, the greater part of the single rifle regiment in the army, the 2nd Dragoons, which had been dismounted a year or 2 before and designated dismounted rifles, was stationed at Fort Jessup, Louisiana, some 25 miles east of the Texas line, to observe the frontier. About the 1st of May, the 3rd Infantry was ordered from Jefferson Barracks to Louisiana to go into camp in the neighborhood of Fort Jessup, and there await further orders. The troops were embarked on steamers and were on their way down the Mississippi within a few days after the receipt of this order. About the time they started, I obtained a leave of absence for 20 days to go to Ohio to visit my parents. I was obliged to go to St. Louis to take a steamer for Louisville or Cincinnati, or the first steamer going up the Ohio River to any point. Before I left, St. Louis orders were received at Jefferson Barracks for the 4th Infantry to follow the 3D. A messenger was sent after me to stop my leaving, but before he could reach me I was off, totally ignorant of these events. A day or 2 after my arrival at Bethel, I received a letter from a classmate and fellow lieutenant in the 4th, informing me of the circumstances related above, and advising me not to open any letter postmarked St. Louis or Jefferson Barracks until the expiration of my leave, and saying that he would pack up my things and take them along for me. His advice was not necessary, for no other letter was sent to me. I now discovered that I was exceedingly anxious to get back to Jefferson Barracks, and I understood the reason without explanation from anyone. My leave of absence required me to report for duty at Jefferson Barracks at the end of 20 days. I knew my regiment had gone up the Red River, but I was not disposed to break the letter of my leave. Besides, If I had proceeded to Louisiana direct, I could not have reached there until after the expiration of my leave. Accordingly, at the end of the 20 days, I reported for duty to Lieutenant Ewell, commanding at Jefferson Barracks, handing him at the same time my leave of absence. After noticing the phraseology of the order, leaves of absence were generally worded, "at the end of which time he will report for duty with his proper command," he said he would give me an order to join my regiment in Louisiana. I then asked for a few days' leave before starting, which he readily granted. This was the same Ewell who acquired considerable reputation as a Confederate general during the rebellion. He was a man much esteemed, and deservedly so, in the old army, and proved himself a gallant and efficient officer in 2 wars, both in my estimation unholy. I immediately procured a horse and started for the country, taking no baggage with me, of course. There is an insignificant creek, the Gravois, between Jefferson Barracks and the place to which I was going, and at that day there was not a bridge over it from its source to its mouth. There is not water enough in the creek at ordinary stages to run a coffee mill, and at low water there is none running whatever. On this occasion it had been raining heavily, and when the creek was reached, I found the banks full to overflowing and the current rapid. I looked at it a moment to consider what to do. One of my superstitions had always been, when I started to go anywhere, or to do anything, not to turn back or stop until the thing intended was accomplished. I have frequently started to go to places where I had never been, and to which I did not know the way, depending upon making inquiries on the road, and if I got past the place without knowing it, instead of turning back, I would go on until a road was found turning in the right direction, take that, and come in by the other side. So I struck into the stream, and in an instant the horse was swimming and I being carried down by the current. I headed the horse towards the other bank and soon reached it, wet through and without other clothes on that side of the stream. I went on, however, to my destination and borrowed a dry suit from my future brother-in-law. We were not of the same size, but the clothes answered every purpose until I got more of my own. Before I returned, I mustered up courage to make known, in the most awkward manner imaginable, the discovery I had made on learning that the 4th Infantry had been ordered away from Jefferson Barracks. The young lady afterwards admitted that she too, although until then she had never looked upon me other than as a visitor whose company was agreeable to her, had experienced a depression of spirits she could not account for when the regiment left. Before separating, it was definitely understood that at a convenient time we would join our fortunes and not let the removal of a regiment trouble us. This was in May 1844. It was the 22nd of August 1848, before the fulfilment of this agreement. My duties kept me on the frontier of Louisiana with the Army of Observation during the pendency of annexation, and afterwards I was absent through the war with Mexico, provoked by the action of the army, if not by the annexation itself. During that time there was a constant correspondence between Miss Dent and myself, but we only met once in the period of 4 years and 3 months. In May 1845, I procured a leave for 20 days, visited St. Louis, and obtained the consent of the parents for the union, which had not been asked for before. As already stated, it was never my intention to remain in the army long, but to prepare myself for a professorship in some college. Accordingly, soon after I was settled at Jefferson Barracks, I wrote a letter to Professor Church, Professor of Mathematics at West Point, requesting him to ask my designation as his assistant, when next a detail had to be made. Assistant professors at West Point are all officers of the army, supposed to be selected for their special fitness for the particular branch of study they are assigned to teach. The answer from Professor Church was entirely satisfactory, and no doubt I should have been detailed a year or 2 later but for the Mexican War coming on. Accordingly, I laid out for myself a course of studies to be pursued in garrison, with regularity if not persistency. I reviewed my West Point course of mathematics during the 7 months at Jefferson Barracks, and read many valuable historical works, besides an occasional novel. To help my memory, I kept a book in which I would write up, from time to time, my recollections of all I had read since last posting it. When the regiment was ordered away, I being absent at the time, My effects were packed up by Lieutenant Haslett of the 4th Infantry and taken along. I never saw my journal after, nor did I ever keep another, except for a portion of the time while travelling abroad. Often since a fear has crossed my mind lest that book might turn up yet and fall into the hands of some malicious person who would publish it. I know its appearance would cause me as much heartburning as my youthful horse trade or the later rebuke for wearing uniform clothes. The 30 Infantry had selected camping grounds on the reservation at Fort Jessup, about midway between the Red River and the Sabine. Our orders required us to go into camp in the same neighbourhood and await further instructions. Those authorised to do so selected a place in the pine woods between the old town of Natchitoches and Grand Ecore, about 3 miles from each, and on high ground back from the river. The place was given the name of Camp Salubrity, and proved entitled to it. The camp was on a high, sandy pine ridge, with spring branches in the valley, in front and rear. The springs furnished an abundance of cool, pure water, and the ridge was above the flight of mosquitoes, which abound in that region in great multitudes and of great voracity. In the valley they swarmed in myriads, but never came to the summit of the ridge. The regiment occupied this camp 6 months before the first death occurred, and that was caused by an accident. There was no intimation given that the removal of the 3D and 4th Regiments of Infantry to the western border of Louisiana was occasioned in any way by the prospective annexation of Texas, but it was generally understood that such was the case. Ostensibly we were intended to prevent filibustering into Texas, but really as a menace to Mexico in case she appeared to contemplate war. Generally the officers of the army were indifferent whether the annexation was consummated or not, but not so all of them. For myself, I was bitterly opposed to the measure, and to this day regard the war, which resulted as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. It was an instance of a republic following the bad example of European monarchies, in not considering justice in their desire to acquire additional territory. Texas was originally a state belonging to the Republic of Mexico. It extended from the Sabine River on the east to the Rio Grande on the west, and from the Gulf of Mexico on the south and east to the territory of the United States and New Mexico, another Mexican state at that time, on the north and west. An empire in territory, it had but a very sparse population, until settled by Americans who had received authority from Mexico to colonize. These colonists paid very little attention to the supreme government and introduced slavery into the state almost from the start, though the Constitution of Mexico did not, nor does it now, sanction that institution. Soon they set up an independent government of their own, and war existed between Texas and Mexico, in name from that time until 1836, when active hostilities very nearly ceased upon the capture of Santa Anna, the Mexican president. Before long, however, the same people, who with permission of Mexico had colonized Texas and afterwards set up slavery there, and then seceded as soon as they felt strong enough to do so, offered themselves and the state to the United States, and in 1845 their offer was accepted. The occupation, separation, and annexation were, from the inception of the movement to its final consummation, a conspiracy to acquire territory out of which slave states might be formed for the American Union. Even if the annexation itself could be justified, the manner in which the subsequent war was forced upon Mexico cannot. The fact is, annexationists wanted more territory than they could possibly lay any claim to, as part of the new acquisition. Texas, as an independent state, never had exercised jurisdiction over the territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Mexico had never recognized the independence of Texas, and maintained that, even if independent, the state had no claim south of the Nueces. I am aware that a treaty, made by the Texans with Santa Anna while he was under duress, ceded all the territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, but he was a prisoner of war when the treaty was made, and his life was in jeopardy. He knew, too, that he deserved execution at the hands of the Texans if they should ever capture him. The Texans, if they had taken his life, would have only followed the example set by Santa Anna himself a few years before, when he executed the entire garrison of the Alamo and the villages of Goliad. In taking military possession of Texas after annexation, the Army of Occupation under General Taylor was directed to occupy the disputed territory. The army did not stop at the Nueces and offer to negotiate for a settlement of the boundary question, but went beyond, apparently in order to force Mexico to initiate war. It is to the credit of the American nation, however, that after conquering Mexico, and while practically holding the country in our possession so that we could have retained the whole of it, or made any terms we chose, we paid a round sum for the additional territory taken, more than it was worth or was likely to be to Mexico. To us it was an empire and of incalculable value, but it might have been obtained by other means. The Southern Rebellion was largely the outgrowth of the Mexican War. Nations, like individuals, are punished for their transgressions. We got our punishment in the most sanguinary and expensive war of modern times. And no doubt my feeling is shared by the few officers living who were there at the time. I can call to mind only 2 officers of the 4th Infantry, besides myself, who were at Camp Salubrity with the regiment, who are now alive. With a war in prospect, and belonging to a regiment that had an unusual number of officers detailed on special duty away from the regiment, my hopes of being ordered to West Point as an instructor vanished. At the time of which I now write, officers in the quartermasters', commissaries, and adjutant generals' departments were appointed from the line of the army and did not vacate their regimental commissions until their regimental and staff commissions were for the same grades. Generally, lieutenants were appointed to captaincies to fill vacancies in the staff corps. If they should reach a captaincy in the line before they arrived at a majority in the staff, they would elect which commission they would retain. In the 4th Infantry in 1844, at least 6 line officers were on duty in the staff, and therefore permanently detached from the regiment. Under these circumstances, I gave up everything like a special course of reading, and only read thereafter for my own amusement, and not very much for that, until the war was over. I kept a horse and rode and stayed outdoors most of the time by day, and entirely recovered from the cough which I had carried from West Point, and from all indications of consumption. I have often thought that my life was saved, and my health restored, by exercise and exposure, enforced by an administrative act and a war, both of which I disapproved. As summer wore away, and cool days and colder nights came upon us, the tents we were occupying ceased to afford comfortable quarters, and further orders not reaching us, we began to look about to remedy the hardship. Men were put to work getting out timber to build huts, and in a very short time all were comfortably housed, privates as well as officers. The outlay by the government in accomplishing this was nothing, or nearly nothing. The winter was spent more agreeably than the summer had been. There were occasional parties given by the planters along the coast, as the bottomlands on the Red River were called. The climate was delightful. Near the close of the short session of Congress of 1844-5, the bill for the annexation of Texas to the United States was passed. It reached President Tyler on the 1st of March, 1845, and promptly received his approval. When the news reached us, we began to look again for further orders. They did not arrive promptly, and on the 1st of May following I asked and obtained a leave of absence for 20 days for the purpose of visiting St. Louis. The object of this visit has been before stated. Early in July the long-expected orders were received, but they only took the regiment to New Orleans barracks. We reached there before the middle of the month, and again waited weeks for still further orders. The yellow fever was raging in New Orleans during the time we remained there, and the streets of the city had the appearance of a continuous, well-observed Sunday. I recollect but one occasion when this observance seemed to be broken by the inhabitants. One morning about daylight I happened to be awake, and hearing the discharge of a rifle not far off, I looked out to ascertain where the sound came from. I observed a couple of clusters of men nearby, and learned afterward that it was nothing, only a couple of gentlemen deciding a difference of opinion with rifles at 20 paces. I do not remember if either was killed or even hurt, but no doubt the question of difference was settled satisfactorily and honourably in the estimation of the parties engaged. I do not believe I ever would have the courage to fight a duel. If any man should wrong me to the extent of my being willing to kill him, I would not be willing to give him the choice of weapons with which it should be done, and of the time, place, and distance separating us when I executed him. If I should do another such a wrong as to justify him in killing me, I would make any reasonable atonement within my power, if convinced of the wrong done. I place my opposition to duelling on higher grounds than here stated. No doubt a majority of the duels fought have been for want of moral courage on the part of those engaged to decline. At Camp Salubrity, and when we went to New Orleans barracks, the 4th Infantry was commanded by Colonel Vose, then an old gentleman who had not commanded on drill for a number of years. He was not a man to discover infirmity in the presence of danger. It now appeared that war was imminent, and he felt that it was his duty to brush up his tactics. Accordingly, when we got settled down at our new post, he took command of the regiment at a battalion drill. Only 2 or 3 evolutions had been gone through when he dismissed the battalion, and turning to go to his own quarters, dropped dead. He had not been complaining of ill health, but no doubt died of heart disease. He was a most estimable man, of exemplary habits, and by no means the author of his own disease. Early in September, the regiment left New Orleans for Corpus Christi, now in Texas. Ocean steamers were not then common, and the passage was made in sailing vessels. At that time there was not more than 3 feet of water in the channel at the outlet of Corpus Christi Bay. The debarkation, therefore, had to take place by small steamers, and at an island in the channel called Shell Island, the ships anchoring some miles out from shore. This made the work slow, and as the army was only supplied with 1 or 2 steamers, it took a number of days to effect the landing of a single regiment with its stores, camp and garrison equipage, etc. There happened to be pleasant weather while this was going on, but the land swell was so great that when the ship and steamer were on opposite sides of the same wave, they would be at a considerable distance apart. The men and baggage were let down to a point higher than the lower deck of the steamer, and when ship and steamer got into the trough between the waves and were close together, the load would be drawn over the steamer and rapidly run down until it rested on the deck. After I had gone ashore, and had been on guard several days at Shell Island, quite 6 miles from the ship, I had occasion for some reason or other to return on board. While on the Souviar, I think that was the name of our vessel, I heard a tremendous racket at the other end of the ship, and much and excited sailor language, such as "damn your eyes," etc. In a moment or two the captain, who was an excitable little man, dying with consumption and not weighing much over 100 pounds, came running out, carrying a sabre nearly as large and as heavy as he was, and crying that his men had mutinied. It was necessary to sustain the captain without question, and in a few minutes all the sailors charged with mutiny were in irons. I rather felt for a time a wish that I had not gone aboard just then. As the men charged with mutiny submitted to being placed in irons without resistance, I always doubted if they knew that they had mutinied until they were told.